Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur.
El cargo de presidente de la República
Mexico's transition to democracy has not been a linear path of progress. From the late 80s with the split in the Revolutionary Institutional Party, to the triumph of the conservatives in 2000, to the return of the ruling party, it's been a bumpy road. There are few people who know this process as well or have played such an active role in it as Porfirio Muñoz Ledo. Here on Interviews from Mexico, we'll be talking to Porfirio Muñoz Ledo about Mexican democracy in this critical election year. Stay tuned.
El país con el gobierno del PRI no va por el camino correcto.
Se han hecho las reformas constitucionales.
Es necesario terminar con la guerra.
To talk about these big issues, we have a uniquely qualified guest with us here today. Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, former congressman, Secretary of Labor and Education, co-founder of the Democratic Front, and currently commissioner of the Political Reform Commission in Mexico City, among many other titles and achievements. Mr. Muñoz Ledo, thank you so much for being with us today on Interviews from Mexico.
Thanks to you, Laurita.
We could go on and on with the extensive curriculum of Mr. Muñoz Ledo, and for viewers who are interested, there's a new book out. It's called Historia Oral, Oral History, and it covers the period from 1933 to 1988 in the life of Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, which also covers the major events of which he was an active part in Mexico during that period. But for now, I want to go straight into the interview. Many people have said that there are parallels between the elections this year in 2008 and what you witnessed in 1988. As a co-founder of the Democratic Front, you witnessed and you protested against fraud in the presidential elections of 1988. And you said in a recent column, the backdrop today is the same. A small group in power and an insatiable technocracy determined to block democratic change.
Exactly.
In this context, can we expect another fraud in 2018 elections?
Look, we're in a very similar situation. In 1988, we made a huge effort to make the election democratic. But the government of Miguel de la Madrid carried out a post-electoral fraud. They didn't think they were going to lose. When they saw the number, they got really scared.
When the election results were coming in.
Exactly, that's a post-electoral fraud, in the sense that they changed the acts of the election, no, and the votes.
So they changed everything after the election. Now they are talking preventive measures. It's a different kind of fraud. It's a pre-electoral fraud. They're using public resources, they're using social programs, they're using all kinds of resources to prevent free elections.
What can the society do to prevent this kind of fraud if it's almost inevitable in these elections?
We are creating a national movement with intellectuals and journalists to confront the country's electoral authorities. I have the documents. I'll send them to you. We're going to confront the country's election authorities in a public debate, including the National Electoral Institute, the Electoral Tribunal, and the FEPADE, the Electoral Prosecutor. We are going to create a large social movement to prevent.
So first of all, it's holding the authorities accountable.
Yes,
we
of
have
course.
a different situation here because in 1988 we didn't have the electoral infrastructure that we have now, and now we have it, but there's still room for fraud?
It's a big deception. I took part in the negotiations in 1994 after the death of Colosio. and the uprising in Chiapas,
las primeras
when the government gave in
autónomas.
and allowed the first autonomous electoral
Luego, en
structures.
96, volví a
Then,
hacerlo.
in 1996,
Logramos en
I did the same
97
thing again. So by 1997, we got finally autonomous electoral structures. That's how we won the majority in the Congress. That's how I was president of. And then the first alternation of power with Vicente Fox. But then the system became corrupted, totally corrupted, because the political parties once again took power over the electoral bodies. Vicente Fox threw democracy out of the window. So what happened? After we achieved opposition majorities and an alternation in government, what happened next were electoral frauds. Vicente Fox, it was him who directed the electoral fraud against López Obrador. You remember how famous that was. He confessed it.
In
I got my
2006.
revenge, he said, of course. So the most fraudulent of all, more than the PRI, was Fox. Then came the electoral fraud of that, well, that was 2006, and then came the fraud in 2012, which brought Peña Nieto into power. And then in 2015, there were the brutal frauds in the states of Mexico and Coahuila. So we're confronting a very difficult situation, but we have several advantages. First, López Obrador is too far ahead from them to cover it up. Second, there will be a social movement to pin down the electoral agencies so that they fulfill their obligations. And we hope to receive support from international organizations as well.
It's a little worrisome that there was just what appears to be a serious fraud in Honduras, and that there
Yes,
was
serious,
kind of
very serious fraud.
minimal international reaction so far to that. Do you think they can still get away with something like that in Mexico?
What we need is for the international audience to have a clear idea that the freedom fighters are us. You know what I mean? There is no awareness that the PRI is the embodiment of corruption. There is no international awareness that the PRI is authoritarian, that the PRI engages in electoral fraud, because there is a certain amount of international complicity with the current situation in Mexico. You know what I mean? So any authoritarian regime around the world gets criticized, except for the PRI. I watch CNN every day, for example. There is never any criticism of the PRI as an authoritarian regime. It's the most authoritarian regime in Latin America.
Well, you have written extensively about this and documented the dictatorship, the authoritarianism of the PRI. To defend the vote, what's going to have to happen to break through this international image of, well, maybe not everything's perfect in Mexico, but they have a democratic government?
No, well, there are three tasks. You just mentioned the first one. Like I said, there is an international complicity with the PRI. It's not that they don't know. There are correspondents from all over the world here, and they're not stupid, and they're not blind. You know what I mean? But still, because it's convenient for them, the great powers, especially the United States, to give their Mexican regime democratic credentials. And that's absolutely absurd. It's the most authoritarian regime in Latin America. Name another regime that's more authoritarian. Maybe in Honduras. That is, so it's proved historical. So first, to raise international awareness about the authoritarian character of the Mexican regime. Second, a social and intellectual mobilization, which we are organizing to confront the electoral authorities. And then a strong attitude in the part of citizens, because if in 2018, this year, there's an electoral fraud, there could be a popular insurrection.
And would this be the electoral observation that you're talking about? Are you already laying the base?
Yeah, but it needs to be done seriously. The election observation, unfortunately, which we have been promoting since 1994, in 1994 when we negotiated with Dr. Cedillo, with the former government still, with Carpizo, that there will be electoral observation. People from the European Union came, a lot of people came from all over the world. But on the day of election, they were acting like tourists. They didn't know what happened before, you know? The electoral observation process should start at the beginning of the electoral process. They come, they watch the votes being counted, but they don't know what this is all being perverted behind the votes.
Especially now when we're not talking about a post-electoral fraud so much as everything that's already starting to happen, maybe.
Exactly. So that they show up on election day. I invited, for example, I was ambassador to the European Union. I invited the European Parliament, and they said everything was okay because they just watched the votes being counted. But they didn't see everything behind the election, the vote being blocked. So electoral observation can't just be on election day. The entire process needs to be observed, and no one can guarantee it.
How do you guarantee a mobilization of the people in defense of the vote? And was that what was lacking in 1988?
In 1988, there was a very important mobilization. The Zócalo was filled up several times. What happened is that the decision was not made to confront the government non-violently, because the political parties in the coalition preferred to accept positions in Congress. For the first time, the opposition had 45%. That was a lot for them, 180 deputies. They were stunned. And they didn't make the fundamental decisions. If they had, they wouldn't have had to back down.
Well, I wanted to go back to then the formation of the Democratic Front, which was such a key moment in the transition to democracy in Mexico, which has had its advances.
To democracy, or to what?
To what, right? And at that time, there were 3 points that you brought out. First of all, national sovereignty, the economic model of concentration, a critique of that economic model, and the system of decision-making at the time. Let's look quickly at those 3. First of all, national sovereignty. You said recently that power is being exercised from abroad in Mexico, and that's reflected in the renegotiation of NAFTA and in the context of U.S. national security.
Well, it was, look, the government of Miguel de la Madrid had been weakened by international pressure. I was the ambassador of Mexico to the United Nations. I was a personal friend of the president. I spoke several times with Miguel de la Madrid, and I was a witness to what happened in October of 1994, when Miguel just went up to Washington. We were all there, the ambassadors in Washington, the president of the Inter-American Bank, who was Antonio Ortiz Mena. We talked with de la Madrid. He gave up everything, accepted all their conditions, in order to establish the Baker Plan. They put the conditions in everything. The privatizations, the whole neoliberal scheme, the deregulations, the privatizations. We were totally shocked. I had a different line in the United Nations. I had been the president of the Group of 77. They had a project to promote national sovereignty. So we started to have problems with the government. Of course. Second, the issue of a popular decision about the elections. The famous finger system. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and I, without having talked to each other in 2 different places, he was the governor of Michoacán and I was the ambassador to the United Nations, we spoke against the finger system.
And that was really the origins of the Democratic Front.
So we successfully created a public awareness against the finger system. How we did it? By nominating a candidate within the party. It was allowed under the rules of the party, the statutes, to propose a candidate. It was allowed, but no one did it. So we ran a candidate inside the party. who was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. And it caused a scandal at the 13th Assembly of the party, where they censored us. So we had to split.
How'd you could do this?
They didn't have the sensibility to accept a candidate from within the party. Like happens in the whole world, the primaries. There is no place on earth where candidates don't run against each other before the open electoral process. But in Mexico it was prohibited, the PRI prohibited, for there to be various candidates for elections. So we had to split. We fought them in the general election, and we won the elections.
And that was really the start of a big moment in a democratic transition. And it went from there to then the election of another party in 2000, and then the return of the PRI. Where are we now? Why has this democratic transition that was unleashed at that moment, why did it stall?
No, the democratic tradition was aborted. Vicente Fox aborted it. Instead of dismantling the old system, he consolidated it. And he betrayed democracy by undertaking a campaign against López Obrador. No president of the PRI was so bold-faced and cynical about meddling in an electoral campaign. You know what I mean? And distorting the principle of universal suffrage.
In that sense, then, in 2006, the candidacy of Andrés Manuel López Obrador represented a possibility to again advance in a democratic transition. Is that the case now, too?
Of course it was. Of course it was. Because it was a game that the government was playing. In 2000, all of us helped bring Fox to power, and in 2006 he betrayed us. And then Calderón betrayal, helping Peña Nieto, was totally fraudulent. Totally fraudulent.
There's a lot of documentation that...
It's documented that Peña Nieto is an illegitimate president. He is illegitimate.
And yet he's in charge of these elections. Although in a recent interview, you indicated that power has passed to his Secretary of International Relations, to Vidigaray. So what's going on?
During one part of the Mexican Revolution, there was a strongman, Calles, General Calles, after the death of General Obregón. So I call him Luis El Callecito. Little Calles. It's like a little street. Because they gave him power, just like De la Madrid passes over power to Salinas. Before leaving office, Peña Nieto passed power over to Videgaray because he is the link to the United States. He brought Trump here. The first state visit, Trump visited Mexico just to keep bashing us.
In this sense of national sovereignty, you mentioned this critical moment when De la Madrid went to the first debt and renegotiation and basically gave away everything. What about now?
The big expectation is that the free trade agreement, NAFTA, we renegotiated after the presidential elections. The White House has already agreed to that. There are clear messages that they prefer to renegotiate NAFTA with whoever is the next president of Mexico. This is very important because it will be a false treaty. Relationship with the United States should be defined by the next government.
There's already been a huge path toward a greater alliance, some would say, and intervention, others would say, particularly in the field of national security. That must have a certain amount of influence in the electoral process as well, no?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. For the United States, it's national security. The conservative sector in the Mexican government has already said, on that, I give in. I accept the United States. I accept your national security. I accept being part of the United States national security system. That's what the Secretary of Economy said, my friend Ildefonso Guajardo.
Y luego
And then
discutimos
we'll discuss
temas
economic issues,
económicos, en los cuales
and there the central part is the automobile industry, and everything else is dead. It doesn't exist. So we have to make the proposal the other way around. First is migration, just like in the old negotiation. Like in many international negotiations, they put the issues on the table. My issue is migration. Your issue is national security, and in the middle are the economic issues. If I was a negotiator, I would put migration on the table. In the original NAFTA negotiations, the Mexican government accepted that the fundamental issues were shown into the side agreements, parallel agreements that are non-binding, which are environment, migration, and labor. Very important issues. No, it's backwards. What are the issues that we have?
Migration didn't even make it on the table.
Right with us, it has to be on the table. So we can be demagogues and say that we're defending Mexicans and not put migration on the table.
But so you're saying there was a quid pro quo. We will accept being part of U.S. national security if we're able to negotiate these economic terms.
There are two extremes. At one end, national security, and in the other, migration. They had to come to a shared position in both things. And in the middle are the economic issues, which can be solved. That's where we have some Trump wins or something. But no, it's clear that we have a level of economic unity that will keep working as long as Trump doesn't keep insisting that Mexican businesses should go to the United States. That's absurd. There is an economic unity that is working, especially in the automotive and auto parts sector, which are the backbone of NAFTA. It's easily resolvable. It's just business agreement. It can be solved. But it's the principal agreement, based on principles that need to be worked out on national security and migration.
And that are not being dealt with mainly because the Mexican government hasn't brought them to the negotiations in that same way.
There needs to be strength and firmness. There is no firmness in the negotiation, there are no clear positions.
Speaking of national security, you also said in a recent interview that the new internal security law or homeland security law is a threat to these elections. Could you explain that?
Well, the interior security law, in the first place, the concept of interior security doesn't exist in the federal constitution. There is just the concept of national security. So they invented a concept of internal security, which is kind of a trap, because we need to clarify the situation. The government of Calderón sent the army to fight drug traffickers. The army didn't want to go. They were forced into it. And then the army said, well, if you send us into this war, we need guarantees, which means to violate human rights. So we're in a trap. The situation isn't giving guarantees to the army. The solution is getting the army out of the internal war. That's the solution. Now, it's an issue of gradual change. It's an issue for new policy that we need to negotiate with the army, and the army is very loyal to the country's institutions. It always has been. And we need to say, well, you're going to be withdrawn, but you're not going to be allowed to violate human rights. That's the big negotiation with the army.
In this context, is there a greater risk that the army could be used, for example, to back up a fraud?
I've spoken about that possibility. But fortunately, there is a phrase in the internal security law that the armed force can't intervene in social protest. So there's something. Now, is there a risk they could use that law in case of social insurrection? Of course. It's a latent threat. But we need to talk to the army. We need to dialogue with the army. It has to be more open, more democratic, more public. We need to appeal to the army about what it is willing to do and what it is not willing to do. We need a wider, more honest democratic debate.
More transparency.
More transparency.
Because one of the concerns is that we're looking at an election where the ruling party is going in with a very unpopular presidency and currently in third place, way behind, which could open the door to...
That's a very good observation. Everything is prepared so that this will end with a contest between Meade and López Obrador. But Meade is at 10% in the polls. So what is the ruling party going to do? Support the candidate of a so-called confederation or alliance led by the PAN? It is possible. It is possible. Today, polls came out that show Anaya, the former president of the PAN, in second place, way ahead of Meade. The issue for the government party is that Meade is unpopular and isn't going to become popular. So what are they going to do? That is the question.
Well, if they did that, would they have to do it like under the table, or would they formally withdraw? Or?
It will be a negotiation. The government can take steps to help the PAN's candidate. Again, it will be very bad. It will mean going back to the PAN government like that of Fox or Calderon. It's a very serious danger.
So it's basically beat López Obrador, whatever it takes.
I think that's the logic of history, and national opinion is moving towards respecting López Obrador's victory.
With these elements that you've described. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Yes.
Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, thank you so much.
Gracias a ti.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.